Hey, welcome everyone. Ken Burgin here from Foodie Coaches, and my guest today, Ian Singer from Australia Migrate. He's a migration agent, been working in this field for quite a few years. I think these guys must get whiplash from the number of changes that are happening every month, every year, change of government, change of policy. Really so important to have a professional to guide you through some of these issues. It's a very important part of your workforce planning, especially in regional areas too. So we've got an opportunity for you to ask questions, and if you'd like to drop them into the comments below the screen, and I've got a couple already that people have asked. Ian, one of the questions that was put in before by a woman, I know she runs a couple of pubs, she said when applying for the employer sponsorship component, that's to be registered, is it worth ticking the box to be an accredited sponsor and paying the extra $420 fee?
It's not just a matter of paying the fee that gets you the accredited sponsor. There's a lot of other requirements that have to be met as well. In addition to that, generally, I haven't really seen an accredited sponsor in the hospitality industry. To give you an idea of the requirements that have to be met, there has to be low volume usage and high percentage of Australian workers. So they're saying that, I'm just reading it off here, Australian workers make up at least 85% of your workforce. We have approved at least one nomination in the last 2 years. We have approved more than 97% of your nomination applications in the last year. You have an annual turnover of at least 4 million for the last 2 years. So that would knock out quite a lot of
Okay, so this is obviously for larger enterprises with a larger workforce. There's certainly going to be fees to pay, but that's one we can save on by the sounds.
I would say it's a no-go for hospitality in general.
Okay. Another question here from Fran. She said, since COVID, there are some exceptions to the 6-month rule, the maximum time for a working holiday visa. And of course, as working holiday visas gain experience, they become more valuable to you and you become attached to them. And she's wondering, is it possible to have exceptions to this or keep people longer till Christmas before someone returns to the UK?
That's a good question, and one that does pop up. So there are exemptions to the rule that for a working holiday visa holder can only work for 6 months for one employer. I've got the exemptions in front of me, but I'm just going to highlight the ones that relate to the hospitality industries. And it says that critical sectors, including agricultural, food processing, and tourism and hospitality, is one of the exemptions in terms of industry, where a 417 working holiday visa can work for longer than 6 months for one employer. Restaurants would fall under, obviously, hospitality. They can just continue to work. They don't actually have to make an application. The person just continues working. It's not a specific application that has to be made.
All right, Ian, we're going to drop his website into the comments below, australiamigrate.com.au, and also recommend when you go to that website, there's a terrific all the questions you never knew that you should be asking, and the latest news is another section too. They put a lot of work into keeping that updated and all the changes that keep happening, and they do a pretty good job of documenting all of that too. Ultimately, I believe professional help is needed in a lot of situations, but you can certainly become a lot wiser with looking at that website. Ian, can I just talk about a more general issue about eligibility? Because when we were chatting the other day, you were talking about the fact that there's a type of cuisine or a type of establishment that's going to be suitable for sponsorship and others are just not going to be approved.
In terms of eligibility, as far as the business goes or as far as the visa applicant, or both?
Yeah, the business, the type of business.
The rules basically always been the same. It hasn't shifted in years. So basically, the department, when they look at a venue or a cafe or restaurant, they want to be sure that it's not a fast food or casual outlet. If they pick up that it is that, then they would deem that is not eligible for a person to be sponsored under. So typically, they would have a look at, is there some kind of a table service? A lot nowadays, people go up to the counter or they order on that app thing through their phone, but that there should be some semblance of the food being brought to their table if that's the way that is ordering. So fast food is definitely a no, meaning that it's like a franchised menu, let's say, not really proper dining experience in the traditional sense of the word. Anything like that, the department would refuse that. They may approve the business, and that's where you think, okay, I'm on my way to getting this whole thing sorted out. So when I say the business, they may approve the sponsorship, but where they're going to knock you back is when you lodge the nomination. If you're in that kind of a setting, would be that it's casual or fast food, it doesn't meet the requirements of a cafe or a restaurant. And also another thing that they would look at as well, whether it meets that definition, is the kind of hierarchy that you've got in the kitchen. So if there's only, let's say, one cook, then they're not going to be satisfied. That is a cafe or restaurant that is offering fairly complex meals. It may just be too basic to warrant it being classified as a cafe or restaurant. And they also can go on the business's website and look at what the menu is.
It all creates a picture, doesn't it?
It does. So if you look at one that is not a fast food or casual, you would think, look, in order to create that particular menu item, you need a chef that understands complexities of food and so on. But they're not looking for high-level complexity. It's not about being an accredited or awarded restaurant, but something that you'd reasonably expect to see non-sort of takeaway casual place.
So no fast food, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting. Are there any other eligibility issues that people get tripped up on, that they think it's going to be easy and there's a few things they didn't tick the box with?
Look, as far as the business goes, the other thing that the department also will look at is the financials of the business. They would expect to see that the latest financials, for example, the year ending 23 financials are presented as prepared by their accountants, not just taken from an MIOB or Xero software, and also the last 4 BAS statements that have been lodged to the ATO. So they're looking at the financials of the business, and if the business is in a position financially to sponsor an overseas person. So if there's enough revenue in the business, going to look at that as well.
What are the costs that they're assuming the business is going to have to meet?
Just that there's a kind of a balance in what the expenses are and the income is. For example, we got a financial from a business yesterday that's not in the hospitality industry, so I'm just using it as an example, but the financials did not mention the salary figure of 65,000 and there's 4 or 5 employees. Now, clearly that's not appropriate disclosure of how the salaries are being worked at. So the department picks up on that and said, how can there be salaries of that little when you've got so many employees? So it has to be a balanced kind of financial document.
It's got to make sense. Let's talk about salary. It's called a market salary, isn't it? Can you explain what that is? And because it seems like it's a little higher than what people might be wanting to pay.
Yes. That's been a bit of a sore thing for the hospitality industry, and understandably so, that previously, up until about a year or so ago, the basic salary was 53,900 for a cook. They call that TSMIT. It stands for the threshold salary, something that they have to meet, 53,900. So that was for cook, chef, or restaurant manager. But whatever salary is presented, you always have to show that it is a market-related salary. What the department then did is that they raised that salary to the angst of the industry. It now sits at 73,150 plus super.
That's a 40% increase almost, isn't it?
They first raised it to 70, and then in July of this year, they raised it to 73,150 plus super. So it would make some restaurants and cafes think twice about sponsoring a person in terms of, is it going to be let's say, a good return on my investment? Just
to clarify, basically that means whoever I sponsor, that's the minimum salary they're going to be paid, no matter what their technical role is.
Yeah, if they're one of the 3 occupations that can be sponsored by a restaurant or cafe, which are cook, chef, or restaurant manager, that's the minimum salary that each of those ones respectively would need to be paid. Then another issue that comes into this market salary is the department require us to address in what way is that salary a market-related salary. In other words, would you pay an Australian citizen or permanent resident the same salary if you were to employ an Australian citizen? And you've got to give an argument around that. Now, what we find is that many restaurants or cafes may not be paying Australian citizens or permanent residents that amount of money for being a cook or a chef or restaurant manager, but you have to pay the overseas worker that amount of money. So you've got to present why it is a market salary. So the way that we would have to go about it is look for adverts on national websites like Indeed, Jara, where there are salaries that are stated of the range of, let's say, 70 to 80,000. So a lot of those adverts are from restaurants advertising a position to meet the nomination requirement. So they state, let's say, 70 to 80,000. Then you take two of those adverts, and then you'd have to state that you would pay an Australian worker the same amount for equivalent work, that you would pay an Australian for equivalent work, but you have not got any Australians who work at the equivalent level of what applicant is. Or if you happen to have one and you are paying that Australian at that equivalent level of 73 or 74, then you would need to show the employment contract of that Australian employee plus a recent salary slip.
And has this jump in the minimum salary, has that affected the number of people applying for sponsorship?
Look, in the beginning, we did see quite a big slowdown. I would say generally, yes, there has been a bit less of an interest, but I think it is slowly gaining a bit more traction as the months go by.
So Kathy's got a question here.
Yeah, sure.
She says, if the applicant is potentially eligible as either a cook or a chef, is it better to go for the chef first? If that should fall through, is it then possible to fall back on the cook category as plan B? Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does make sense. It's a debate that we often have amongst my staff is that, firstly, they both have to be paid the same salary as a minimum. But just as a bit of caution, although the minimum salary is 73,150, it's better to make it a little bit more than that, just so that you don't want the department to think that you're only paying that to get a visa outcome. So that also raises their suspicion if you peg it exactly at that minimum of 73,150. But for a cook, the lodgement fee of the visa is about half the price of a chef. So it's about 1,495, whereas a chef is 3,115.
Okay, wow, that's quite a difference.
So it does save about $1,500 on that lodgement. And nowadays, all cooks and chefs and just about anybody looking for a 482 visa that we deal with wants to ultimately apply for a 186, which is a permanent visa, which they can do 2 years after holding a 482 visa. So before there was a kind of a separation of which occupations could do that and which couldn't. So cooks and restaurant managers were on the short-term occupation list and were prevented from applying for a 186, but now they've taken away that kind of separation, and anybody holding a 482, no matter what their occupation is, can apply for the permanent visa after 2 years. So it doesn't matter in reality if they're a cook or a chef. So then we have to look at what their CVs look like. So if they've been quite clearly working as a chef, you may not want to downgrade them, so to speak, to a cook. But if it's like a bit of a gray area and they could go either way, cook or chef, then you probably should just go cook, because it's going to be the same outcome at the end of the day.
Sure. So that brings up the questions about qualifications and certification of qualifications for overseas people and credentials. Can you talk us through that, what we should be watching for?
Okay, the easiest sort of application is that if an applicant has studied hospitality, commercial cookery and hospitality at a course accredited in Australia by an Australian college or vocational institution, then they do not have to do the skills assessment. That means that the department recognizes that they've had appropriate training in that industry. So they can then go straight on to lodging a 482 visa or a training visa, which we can touch on, but they can go on to lodging a 482 visa so long as they've also had 2 years of work experience, either as a cook or a chef, depending on which of those that you're going to nominate them in. And that work experience could have been acquired while they were studying as well in Australia. If, however, let's say the applicant comes from certain countries where they do require skill assessment, and in other words, they have not studied in Australia, they've got their work experience and maybe studied in that offshore country, then they have to undertake a skill assessment through CES, and that is designated by TRA to undertake.
And that'll be done overseas or when they get here?
They can do it when they get here. It's really a rigorous type of application. So if they don't have the necessary backup to meet that skill assessment requirement, such as employment references, but not only, they also need evidence of being paid for their work, which developing countries, they don't have the same formal system like we have in Australia. Like if they're coming from, let's say, India, Nepal, Philippines, they may just get paid cash, or there's no trail of how they've been paid. And that means that they won't meet the skill assessment. If they come from European countries like Italy and France, they don't need a skill assessment. So there's only certain countries that have been, let's say, identified that if you come from that country and you have not undertaken a formal course in Australia in commercial cookery or hospitality, you need a skill assessment.
Okay. Another question was from a woman who's in a regional area and
Yes.
is very close to signing up with a company where they will find an applicant, someone suitable overseas and manage the whole, the flights and the accreditation and all those kind of things. And she's nervous, understandably, because there's a lot of money involved in this. What are your thoughts about the import route?
Look at what they actually are offering. I'd only get involved in that situation if they had, let's say, a decision-ready applicant. In other words, if it's from a country where they need a skill assessment, the applicant has already got a skill assessment finalized, because that in itself can take over a year to get.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because it's not like a quick, like 1 day thing. It can take a year because firstly, they've got to present evidentiary requirements of their qualifications and work experience, and then they've got to attend an interview. And the interviews are not lined up one day after another, they're months apart. So this member would need to make sure that the person is decision ready, number one, in terms of the skill assessment, and also they've got sufficient work experience to meet the requirements of a 482 visa, and they've done the English test also to meet the English requirements as well.
So that's an IELTS English certain standard, is it?
Yeah. Yes. So if they can present a candidate that meets all of that, then, then it's be not a bad investment. But if they say, look, we'll source somebody for you, and you've got to start from scratch, I wouldn't get involved in that.
Okay. So you've brought up the question about time. Can you tell us a bit about times? Because times work in different ways with this. Recently, someone I know was quite panic stricken because someone's visa was running out soon and there was a change of conditions and there's no time. And then other things, you're talking about 12 months and longer for approval for things. You better tell us about both ends of the time spectrum.
Time, the immigration world takes on a new meaning. So one's got to learn the value of patience. Not that's a good thing that you want to learn in terms of business. But so we're talking about, firstly, if there's a skill assessment requirement, like I mentioned, for an applicant from overseas, that skill assessment, as I mentioned, can take a year. If the person, let's say, is in Australia on a student visa or a graduate skilled visa, when you lodge a 482 visa or a nomination that precedes the 482 application, and their visa is going to expire, it doesn't matter so long as the application is lodged before their visa expires, because then they go into a bridging visa and they can continue working on that bridging visa. So the bridging visa is like a holding bay while the department take their time to assess that application. They are taking a bit longer now on 482s. We're finding they're taking 3 to 4 months, whereas at the beginning of the year and late last year, they were taking 2 to 3 weeks. So there's been quite a big change in their turnaround, which is disappointing and is driving some of the employers mad that are not able to employ that person for a particular reason.
You're the one who gets the cranky phone calls, eh?
A lot, and emails. Be careful not to overpromise, because we know that they are taking longer. But
is there value in getting your local MP involved to advocate?
No, we have some of our clients over the years have approached MPs. MPs don't really like getting involved in it because it's dealing with home affairs. But not only that, you don't get any real outcome out of it. It's a lot of energy for no real benefit.
Yeah, there's been too many scandals in the past.
It's not on their priority list, and it's not really going to get you anywhere.
Are there any other compliance obligations for a sponsor business? You've got to be paying them correctly, obviously. And are they indebted to you? Or if this person is very unhappy, can they just quit the way a normal employee would quit? Or what's the status?
That's a good question. Okay. Yes, when you become a business sponsor, there are definite obligations that a sponsor has. And on the Department of Home Affairs website, if you just typed in, for example, sponsor obligations, Home Affairs, on Google, it should bring you to that page. It is really worthwhile and important to know what your obligations are, because if the department come back and what they call monitor a business. And they can do that randomly. They can either suddenly decide to pick on a particular business, or if there's a disgruntled employee that dobs that business in, then they may look further into it. And when they monitor a business, what happens is that it's handed over to another area within Home Affairs called Border Force. They're like semi-policemen, but not as pleasant. I actually went with a client to Sydney Airport about a year or so ago, and they've got a whole building just dedicated to Border Force. I was quite amazed. I didn't know that it existed. Obviously, not only to do with visa matters, but general border matters. If they want to pick on a particular business, the kind of thing that they're going to send a letter on, and it's quite a threatening letter, it's not like a friendly letter, is they're going to ask for evidence of pay records of all sponsored employees, employment contracts, evidence about how you arrived at the salary of that person. And they look at that in a lot of detail to make sure that you have paid that person according to the employment contract. And another thing that they can look at as well and get employers into a lot of trouble is that when an application is lodged, there's two parts to it. There's the nomination part and the visa application part. So the employer is responsible to pay the government fees for the nomination, and the employer or the visa applicant can pay for the visa application. If the employer passes on the nomination charge to the employee and the government become aware of that, that can land you in a lot of hot water. And if a disgruntled employer complains about that and you can't prove otherwise, they can do one of the following things, is that they can fine you a few $1,000s or more, and maybe sanction you from sponsoring anyone
Something
else.
to stay away from. I've got a couple more questions just dropped in, Ian, before we wrap up. Sam says, I've got a staff member with a visa expiring on the 5th of September. We're going through an agent to put her onto a training visa. Is it likely she'll get a bridging visa issued over the next week? How quickly is that process?
If they lodge the 407, which is a training visa, or for that matter, any visa, they automatically will get a bridging visa on the day that application is lodged. And that bridging visa will then continue for as long as the department take to make a decision on the application.
And Donna's got a chef who's been with her for 1 year. A nomination was just approved last week, but he's been given a bridging visa E twice and now has until 2nd of September to book a flight out. I've had conflicting information about what to do about this.
Look, on a bridging visa, you cannot lodge a 482 visa when you're in Australia. Now, we'd have to look at why he got a bridging visa E. That would be because he was probably in Australia without a visa. So his visa expired and he had not lodged anything prior to it expiring. But it's hard to know the exact situation in terms of his visa compliance issues. So we'd have to have a look at that.
Terrific. Okay. And last question from Gladys. I'm doing a West African cuisine restaurant. The cook I'm trying to sponsor was assessed based on Asian cuisine, which is not what she's looking for, and the cook is overseas. How do I get her here?
So she had a skill assessment in Asian cuisine, but you haven't got any Asian food in your menu.
Yeah.
Just the top of my head, but this sounds a bit obvious, is to have some Asian cuisine in the menu to start off with. They can bring that up as not a valid skill assessment if it's not too Asian orientated and you're not an Asian restaurant.
Sure. So maybe Gladys's menu might be having a little bit of adaptation. Ian, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and years of time.
Pleasure, anytime.
And really highly recommend everyone get professional advice with this. Thanks so much, Ian. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.